all my work over the years, my desire has always been to try to capture people's lives in the round, across the different sites and institutions that they're part of, and see how people kind of move from the boundaries of the private into the public and then back to the private. And now my interest is really to see how digital media in public and private spaces are reconfiguring the possibilities for communication, relationships, and especially in relation to young people, reconfiguring the opportunities and risks that they face in their lives. Despite the hyperbole about everything changing, there are lots of continuities from the lives of the children that we studied to our own childhoods, though we're all of various generations. School, friends, family, a very immediate locale, humdrum, everyday, daily routines. These are all still the important sources of continuity, even though young people have digital media on their screens, in the classroom, in their ears, in their pockets, in their bedrooms, and so forth. We've been focusing really on the question of how children and young people are being repositioned at a time of change. And some of that repositioning concerns the conditions for childhood itself, the reconstruction of family, the competitive pressures on schools, the extended transition to adulthood, uncertain unemployment, heightened ambitions in a kind of celebritized culture. Some of the changes concern how society views children and young people. Ulrich Beck talks about how we have invested in young people the kind of hopes for enchantment that we so much seek in our otherwise and increasingly cynical lives. Anthony Giddens talks about how we variously try to colonize the future the more anxious we become about the future, and we invest in our children as a way of kind of trying to control and direct our own pathways to the future. So the figure of the child is very often framed by risk, anxiety, and hope in kind of equal measure. And there's a lot of kind of concern, but also interest, I think, in the way in which parents and teachers are kind of hovering around children, and everything becomes part of the calculus for possible success. Efforts to preserve valued traditions, worries about inequality, and yet at the same time parents and teachers invest in young people very unequally and kind of perpetuate those inequalities, often in the name of choice. So the project is part of a bigger effort led by the MacArthur Foundation, which is an educational foundation largely working in the US, which is kind of working with the notion of connected learning, sort of on the assumption that schools are in some ways broken, that families are in many ways struggling, and interested in the ways in which informal learning spaces, youth-oriented spaces, and digitally media-supported spaces could somehow compensate, work around, reinvigorate, refresh the kind of pathways to opportunity that we would all like for our young people. Very often in this work, there's a tendency to kind of celebrate the extraordinary, the amazingly creative child, the vlogger who gets the million views, the kids who learn to hack or code or do exciting and extraordinary things. And so in the class, as a kind of counterpoint to that, we wanted to focus on, as it were, the ordinary, hence our choice of a perfectly ordinary London school. Not to say ordinary is homogenous, but to say ordinary is in fact extraordinarily diverse, but not necessarily, as it were, exceptional in the ways that are sometimes celebrated. So my kind of theory in a nutshell is to say, from the point of view of children and young people, their lives are kind of pretty much centered on home, school, and kind of the community of peers. And what the connected learning vision adds to that is to say, well, home is perhaps primarily where the socialization of values and interests comes about. Academic learning and achievement, of course, is primarily recognized by the school. And let's not forget the importance of community and peers as offering opportunities for participation and recognition, a kind of identity validation. And I've put a cloud that you can see, which I think of as the digital. And every morning when I get up and wonder what I'm doing, I ask myself the question, so what difference does it make that all of this is somehow happening also in the cloud, literally and figuratively? So digital media, we could see, maybe are kind of connecting, enhancing those links, helping with the connections, or perhaps they are impeding, introducing new risks, introducing new problems. But one class of school children live very local lives, and despite this being a global society and huge numbers of connections possible in the world, young people still live within a very few square miles, and our site for fieldwork, like those of many young people, is divided by the proverbial tracks. So on one side we have the more middle-class kids, on the other side we have the poorer kids, but they come together around a school, and we've just kind of mapped where they live just to show how very kind of local and in some ways parochial their lives are, even though in other ways their connections, familial and digital, take them indeed across the globe. In our project, we spent the year working with these 28 kids insofar as they would let us, and they were remarkably kind of trusting and welcoming, which was a real pleasure in the field work. And more or less, we spent a term in the classroom working with them, sitting, observing, playgrounds, lunch queues, all of that. We spent the second term visiting homes, hanging out in bedrooms, talking to parents, meeting the pets and the siblings. And the third term, trying to do more stuff in the community and with the peers, going to music lessons, going to play football, trying to get as far as we could into their kind of small worlds and understand where the digital opened that up. Okay, I want to tell you two kinds of stories that offered a way of our intersecting, and they both, in different ways, focus on questions of relationships, equality or inequality, and learning as the digital is reconfiguring those. So the first is to give you a different way of capturing the relations among my 28 children. Everyday life and social relationships are made up of a lot of kind of micro actions. Who do you hang out with after school? Who do you tell your problems to? Who do you ask for help with homework? And the network is made up of asking all the kids all of these questions, and then mapping the within class network. So this is the relationships within the class, and for me it was significant in a number of crucial ways. One was that this was a class, like many in London, where the refugee child sits next to the millionaire child, and a kind of civility is created. Even though there is enormous difference within the classroom, there is a kind of a harmonious, not necessarily deep, but a harmonious civility generated through a lot of effort by the children, the teachers, the school context, and indeed the parents. Interesting for those who committed to media education, one way of doing that was to create a common language and a kind of shared repertoire of understanding around popular media. Not always the right popular media for the kids' real interests, but a kind of shared language of popular media and popular culture. So beneath this veneer, the social network immediately revealed the fractures. So what's significant is that this is a group of boys, largely middle class, pretty highly interconnected. They are, as it were, the popular core to the class. They create the action. Over here we have a group of more ethnic minority boys, often from poorer homes, and they kind of generated a rather separate group. Over here we have ethnic minority girls, and they were, again, connected to themselves, but not so much to the core. Here we have the two girls who the school has deemed gifted and talented, who are different ethnicities, but both middle class. Here we have the popular girls, very connected to the dense core of popular boys. And here we have a little clique that kind of hung together, which were demographically mixed, and they hung together around a number of things to do with being outsiders. And they expressed their outsiderdom partly through being avid fans of Harry Potter. So there's a kind of civility in the classroom that allows children from very different backgrounds to sit together. And then there's, underneath it, there's a kind of rather familiar demographic breakdown, which is enacted through daily life. If I'd added who are you friends with on Facebook to this group, the whole screen would be black because everyone was connected. And what we learned from that, and then from looking at what the kids posted on Facebook, is that Facebook has become, for these young people, also a space of civility, a space where everyone is connected, everyone is present, but not very much of significance is said. But the fact of connection itself has its meanings. And then, beneath that, there are lots of different online spaces which underpin and reinforce the different kinds of possibilities. The boys over here are kind of avid gamers, and they have one kind of gaming world, and this was a rather different gaming world. And then these were involved in a kind of world of exploration of online creativity, and these were avid social networkers. and these kids were all actually going in rather different directions, often around music and fashion. And the different spaces that the online afforded took them away, but they still came back to that kind of Facebook moment of civility. Okay, now, notice Dilruba here on the edge and Gideon here on the center. And I want to show you the class from a different perspective. So then we said to all of them, including Dilruba, okay, now tell me who is important to you and answer all those questions again. Who do you ask for homework help? Who do you hang out with? Who do you take a problem to? And all the names in clouds are from children outside the school. And what we immediately see is Dilruba was on the edge of the class, but she is the center of something of her own world, which is extremely populated, not peripheral. It's just that her center is not the school's center, but she has a different world. Gideon, who was in the center of the class network, the most popular boy. Square boxes are children in the school but not in the class, round in the class, and underlined are relatives. And what we see about that popular boy with his 1,000 Facebook friends in the middle of the kind of popular boys network is actually, he's still primarily attached to his family, and his family is what's important. And the 1,000 Facebook friends is, as it unfolded, a kind of pose. And his popularity in the class is a kind of pose. And as we got to know Gideon, we heard a rather kind of uncertain and problematic story of a boy who wasn't quite adjusting and wasn't quite sure of his place and lacked confidence and got into trouble. And so at school there's one kind of projection, on Facebook there's another effort to create a successful self, and at home there's a boy who is really very committed and sustained by his family. And I say that especially to all of those parents who worry that their child has 1,000 Facebook friends and so has forgotten that they as family matter. So what difference does the digital make? On the one hand, it's underpinning a kind of civility that allows very different children from very different backgrounds to get on with each other in a way that I think society values, and that allows them to kind of, and that they extend into the world of Facebook. And on the other hand, it allows them to create rather smaller private worlds where they can engage in different ways with different kinds of worlds. So my second kind of case, also about technology in the school. When we walked into the school, and this was a few years ago now, but I think schools are not so different, it was full of exhortations to be the best you could, to raise your level, to achieve what you can, and explanations of what was, as we came to see it, your kind of individualized pathway to success, because every child could be at a different level, but everyone had to be on the pathway. And the exhortations on the school walls were translated and repeated in the conversations that teachers and children had every day. Hi, how are you doing in maths? Well, I'm not so bad. I'm a 5A and I hope to rise to become a 6B soon. The language of levels was the language of learning. And the language of learning being in terms of the levels, and this is the levels of the UK national curriculum, recently cancelled but somehow still being enacted, served to make for a very effective communication within the school and a radical break between the learning that could happen in the school and the learning that could happen at home. Because if a child was grade 3 on the violin at home, or learning to play, do football at home, it didn't have a levels connection, and it couldn't be recognised within the school, and it couldn't, in the language of connected learning, kind of complete that circle. Very effective within the school, and completely underpinned by digital technology. So the school information management system was recording where children were in their level, in their achievements, several data points per child per day, recording behaviour, attendance and achievement, in a way that very often took the teacher here rather than here, because this was a lot of data to be recorded. And the beginning and end of each day would begin with a kind of readout. Yesterday you were here, I hope by the end of the day you'll be there. Well done to you, you raised your level, well, problematic, you have to do better tomorrow. The digital technology very effectively used in the school, instrumentalized and kind of eased and amplified a language that we read as undermining many of the values of learning and education that one might hope for, but the children and the teachers and the parents generally welcomed. So Here we have an example of a boy saying, they would tell us the calculus, and they would love to tell us the calculus. He's doing it for behaviour, but they would read it out and it would become a way of reducing uncertainty precisely by saying, I know how to calculate my performance and my behaviour because I know how many concerns and how many it takes to get at attention and so forth. Salma likes the fact that they are tracking her levels and that she knows exactly what she is, and so do all the teachers, because it's a kind of measure of achievement and it gives her a kind of certainty. Gideon, who I just told you about, uses it to track his psychological health. He can tell he is improving and getting kind of control over his being and his identity through the language of saying where he is in terms of the metrics of behaviour and achievement. And then Ariana's dad, who's a middle-class man, expresses a kind of pleasure from the parent side to say, well, this is a school where the refugee kid sits next to the millionaire child and everyone is enormously diverse, and the metric implemented by the digital information system provides a kind of fair language where everyone knows the rules and everyone has an equal chance to compete, even though, of course, they don't. So compare the order of the school system with the muddle of the home system. All of us who are parents know we are buying digital media for the home of all kinds and shoving it in corners and wherever it will fit, and it's muddled up with fandoms and enthusiasms, and a lot of it is broken, a lot of it is squeezed in, much of it is heavily used. It does represent the kind of fertile possibilities that connected learning enthusiasts would want. It does harness young people's interests. It's there mixed up with Harry Potter and love of music and so on. And the tech is kind of infused and enabling those possibilities. But it is relatively disconnected from the school and struggling to find recognition within that kind of very closed language of achievement and instrumentalized learning. And so what we saw was a real disconnect where teachers saw the muddle and mess of home life as problematic and sort of needing them to try to order it through messages home and emails and exhortations to parents. And children, and in some ways parents, saw those exhortations coming home as something they needed to rebut and rebuff, because what they needed was to keep their kind of fertile, friendly, often private and relatively more creative spaces. So we had lots of stories of the way in which parents were arranging the home, and they arranged it with kind of two core motivations. One was to find ways to be with their children in an age where they knew everyone was about to go off and become absorbed in their separate screen. And they would come together around the technology and shared media interests as much as they would use those media to diffuse family tensions and send people in their different directions. And at the same time, they were buying a lot of this, why did you get this? We got it to help the kids' education, would be the common argument. And sometimes those spaces would be arranged in ways that made sense to the parent. The child might go along with it, but were unrecognised or didn't make much sense to the teachers. When I began working in the Connected Learning Network, and I just suddenly saw the word connections absolutely everywhere, including on churches, Connect to God, and LSE, Connect to the World. And connections are kind of everywhere. And the logic, it seems to me, of the digital age is to say connections are good and disconnections are bad. What the digital can do par excellence is connect us all. So I think what I'm really trying to say in relation to the ways in which children are moving across those sites of home, learning, peer group, is that there are some ways in which they accept that language, they accept that possibility and even and go along with it, that the connections can create more opportunities. But for the most part, and in their kind of more private and committed selves, it's the disconnections that also matter, and I would love disconnection to have a more positive ring. The seeking of private or intimate or separate spaces where children, and they don't have a lot of autonomy in their lives, but where children can feel that they do have some autonomy. So we conclude the book in terms of thinking about 3 C's. One is that world of competition that in many ways school and education has come to instantiate, but in many ways parents, especially middle-class parents, also instantiate in buying as many violin lessons and tennis club memberships and so on for their children that they can. There is a kind of relentless competitive individualism that is gripping many children's lives. Pulling against that, we saw a kind of conservatism, which I would summarize with a small c, conservatism, which was a kind of effort to reassert the tradition of culture. And we saw this in all kinds of families, from the Turkish family who wanted to keep alive the tradition with the home, well, they were part of the diaspora and therefore taught their child the saz, which is a Turkish kind of lute type instrument, on which he was fantastic, and he played it to keep alive his connections with the culture he came from, but was completely unrecognised by the school, which understood about the grade system for piano and violin, but had never heard of a saz. Or I could think about that conservatism in terms of some of the more bohemian families, and there were a number that were really quite arty and flexible and didn't want to join the competitive world of the school, and so would quietly make a space of different values at home, which is conservative in there, a little nostalgic perhaps, but definitely setting itself against the kind of driven nature of school life. And then there's the last C is the question of connection. When is it that connections can be beneficial and open up new possibilities for creativity or for civic engagement or for new kinds of learning, as the connected learning folk would like? But also when are disconnections better and desired? And one of the many ways in which young people, through their kind of refusals to Facebook their teacher or answer emails from the school or visit the teacher's blogs, or many small refusals to participate in efforts to connect them, and those seem to us to be very meaningful. So I'm kind of left with the question, really. I don't give up on the hope of connections, but I think we probably collectively need to do more to articulate what would be the pathways to what kinds of connections, so that we don't exhort everyone to connect in every way all the time, but we allow for recognition of spaces when children need to be separate, private, in control of a small world, and when can connections be fostered that are positive for their learning and future.